I pin upon the map the most chilling and terrifying stories I have ever heard. Today I'll tell you how a married couple found themselves on an abandoned cruise liner near Bermuda, and why, for the sake of their lives, they shouldn't have tried to escape. Share in the comments the horror legends from your city, and I will transform them into haunting and grim stories, utilizing all my writing prowess and talent. That morning, I awoke to an oppressive, all-encompassing silence. It was sinister and thick like tar, enveloping everything around, filling the entire space, permeating every corner of the cruise liner. No sound of waves crashing against the hull, no creaking of parts, no conversations of passengers through the thin walls. I strained my ears, hoping to catch at least one familiar sound, but there was lifeless silence all around. It was the first time I had encountered such a phenomenon. My wife, Marta, had also woken up. She looked at me intently, as if searching for answers, but I couldn't comprehend what was happening either. She got up, but her movement was somehow sluggish, as if something was holding her attention. I heard the sound of her body moving, the bed and her clothes. They sounded so surreal, yet it was the only thing that assured me I hadn't gone mad. She remained silent, as did I, sensing that something in this world had broken, something we couldn't yet understand. We dressed quickly, though the growing sense of anxiety made it hard to focus on simple actions. It seemed as if a whisper was penetrating my soul through all this silence, but I couldn't hear it with my ears. Everything around was frozen in deafening silence. Something sinister was slowly enveloping my soul, causing my gaze to slide over the dark corners of the cabin, as if something invisible was hiding there, something I couldn't see but felt with my entire being. Marta remained silent, and I didn't dare break the silence either. It felt as if our voices might awaken something dreadful that lived within this silence. We stepped into the corridor, and a new wave of fear washed over me. The corridor was empty, unnaturally empty, and it instilled an inexplicable horror in me. Not a sound, no footsteps, no whispers, no echoes of life on board. Everything around was so hopelessly quiet that even my own breathing seemed too loud. Marta stopped by the door of our cabin, and I saw her fingers trembling as they held the door handle. I felt like I was suffocating. I couldn't just stand there any longer, waiting for something to happen. Something terrible was gnawing at me from the inside, forcing me to move forward, to find at least someone. So, hesitating only for a moment, I told Marta to stay in the cabin. She nodded silently, though her gaze seemed to speak of something more, an unspoken fear of what I might find. I began walking through the corridors, each step echoing loudly in the empty spaces. Everything was wrong. No staff, no passengers, not a single familiar face. The liner seemed abandoned, like an old ghost drifting in the open sea. I peeked into every open room. Empty. No sound. With each new step, with each empty room, the cold fear pulled me deeper. I could only hear the pounding of my own heart, loud and anxious. One thought kept spinning in my head. How is this possible? Where did all these people go? I walked through the entire ship, from the sleeping decks to the restaurant, even went up to the captain's bridge. But there, no one. No captain, no crew. Even the map and compass were in place, as if the ship was drifting on its own. And then I realized we were alone. The way to the restaurant was unusually quiet. The corridors were empty, and even the usual noise of the ship's mechanisms seemed muffled. The doors to the restaurant were open, and inside I was met with emptiness. The tables were set, food was on the tables, but there were no passengers, no staff anywhere. I decided to return to Marta immediately. My head was still buzzing from the eerie emptiness that reigned on board, but one thing I knew for sure. I couldn't leave her alone. The corridors seemed endless, each turn reinforcing the feeling that we were trapped in this cursed place. I walked quickly, almost running, and with each step there was still a glimmer of hope to meet someone. Someone who could explain what was happening here. But again, emptiness. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all were silent in the terrifying empty silence. At that moment, I began to curse this ill-fated tour that had so captivated Marta. How did I let myself be convinced? Back then, everything seemed so different. I vividly remembered that evening when I came home from work, tired but happy, knowing that Marta was waiting for me. She greeted me with a smile that shone in her eyes, and I immediately knew she was hiding something. Over dinner, she excitedly told me that we were in for a real surprise. A cruise across the Atlantic Ocean. Our wedding anniversary was approaching, and Marta had decided to take this step after seeing an advertisement online. The price was laughably low, so low that even I raised an eyebrow suspiciously. But her enthusiasm was contagious. She always loved discounts and great deals. I saw no reason to refuse. Back then it all seemed like a good idea. No warning signs. Nothing to hint that what awaited us was not relaxation, but something far worse. Now moving through these empty corridors, I couldn't shake the feeling that that day marked the beginning of a catastrophe. Something had been wrong from the start, and we hadn't noticed. Another wave of horror washed over me as I recalled her joyful face, her words about how unforgettable this cruise would be. And now everything had indeed become unforgettable, but not in the way we had imagined. As I approached the cabin door, my heart suddenly clenched in my chest. And then, as if to confirm my worst fears, it happened. Marta's scream, terrifying, piercing, desperate. It burned through me. I couldn't move, feeling the blood freeze in my veins. It wasn't just fear. It was terror, the kind that makes you want to flee, but you're running not from something specific, but from reality itself. Gathering my strength, I rushed into the cabin. Marta was lying on the floor, curled up like a small child hiding from the dark. She was gasping for air, her body shaking with panic. She didn't open her eyes, as if she had seen something so horrifying that the mere thought of it could drive her mad. Her face was pale. Her hands clutched her knees tightly. She had turned away from the mirror, as if it had become the source of all her fear. This scene filled my mind with a chilling sense of irreparable danger. I tried to bring her back to her senses, but it was as if Marta couldn't feel me. Her lips moved silently, and her eyes remained tightly shut. She couldn't, or perhaps didn't want to open them again, as if what she had seen was better left unseen a second time. But even in that state, her hand trembled, pointing at the mirror. It seemed like a joke. The mirror couldn't be the cause of her fear. But when I turned my head and looked at it, my world froze for a moment too. On the surface of the mirror was a clear handprint. Not on the outside, it was inside, as if someone was trying to escape from the depths of the glass. It couldn't be real, but it was. I moved closer, not even feeling the chill running down my spine. My fingers touched the mirror, gently sliding over its surface, trying to find an explanation. But the mirror remained perfectly smooth. Only that handprint seemed to pierce me with its ghostly trace. I felt my heart beat faster as another handprint appeared next to the first, and another. Before my eyes, handprints began to multiply on the mirror, as if someone, something, was desperately trying to break free from within. It was like a nightmare, where you're paralyzed by your own fear, unable to escape. I recoiled, trying to comprehend what it meant. The air grew heavy, as if something invisible was squeezing my lungs. From this pressure came despair, an inexplicable fear, and a frantic desire to flee as far away from this place as possible. Without thinking any longer, I lifted Marta, who was still in a state of shock. Her body was limp, as if she had fallen out of this world, leaving only a shell behind. I led her out of the cabin, closing the door behind us, trying to contain the growing terror that loomed over us. We walked aimlessly, just wandering like lost souls in the boundless darkness that enveloped us. Marta could barely stand. Her steps were heavy, trembling, as if each movement required incredible effort. She no longer cried, but her body continued to tremble. Her hands instinctively clutched mine, as if it was the only thing that still connected her to the world. She shook her head at all my attempts to speak, pressing her lips together as if she didn't want to say a word. Her eyes, when they finally met mine, were filled with despair and horror. "You wouldn't want to see it," she whispered barely audibly, lowering her head as if from a sentence that couldn't be avoided. The corridors around us seemed even colder and emptier than when we first woke up. Yesterday, these places were filled with laughter, conversations, sounds of entertainment and joy. Now all of that had vanished, leaving only soulless emptiness. Each step echoed hollowly through the dead spaces. We passed by pools that were once filled with happy people, but now the water seemed unpleasantly stagnant, as if no one had touched it for a long time. The spa, which yesterday was a cozy oasis of calm, now resembled a cold and dead shell of something that no longer existed. We reached the communication room, where I hoped to find salvation, though I no longer truly believed in it. Marta stood aside, staring at the floor, immersed in her own horrors, while I tried to establish contact with the outside world. But it was in vain. The radio was silent, as if it had long abandoned us along with all the people. No signal, no sound, only lifeless silence, as oppressive as everything around. Something in this silence made my heart clench even tighter. Marta seemed to feel it too. Her body continued to shake from the invisible threat that slowly crept upon us from all sides. At that moment, I heard it, a strange sound, something like the echo of footsteps, barely noticeable amidst the deafening silence of the ship. It was almost indistinguishable, like an echo from another dimension, but it made me freeze. I strained to listen more closely. My heart pounded wildly in my chest. What could it be? A passenger? The crew? I instructed Marta to stay in the communication room, lock the door, and wait for any news while I decided to follow the strange sound. My legs moved on their own, my steps becoming quieter and more cautious. But each one echoed through the empty corridors, betraying me to the unseen force. The further I went, the tighter my heart clenched. Fear spread inside me like a cold fog, and I could barely control it. At every turn of the ship, the same empty view greeted me. No people, no life, only cold walls and darkness that silently enveloped everything around. Suddenly, I remembered Natalie and Max, our new acquaintances whom we had met over dinner. With hope, I decided to check their cabin, hoping that at least they had stayed and could give me some answers, even a crumb of explanation. But when I knocked on the door, only silence greeted me. I knocked again. Still nothing. My fingers tightened around the door handle, and I slowly opened it. An empty room lay before me, but everything looked as if they had just stepped out. The beds were neatly made, their belongings carefully arranged. But something felt wrong. I stood in the middle of the cabin, listening, looking around every corner of the room, searching for the slightest hint of their presence. But only dead silence reigned here. Suddenly something alarmed me. A strange sound, a scraping noise coming from behind the bathroom door. I froze. The noise pierced the silence like a sharp knife, and I felt a cold horror envelop my entire body. My heart stopped for a moment, and my thoughts swirled into chaos. Slowly, extremely cautiously, I took a step towards the door. Each step felt unbearably long. I pressed the handle and carefully opened the door. Darkness swallowed the small space of the bathroom, and I saw nothing. Only darkness, impenetrable and boundless. My breath was heavy, ragged, and my heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest. I was about to recoil when a terrible, piercing scream erupted from the darkness, slicing through the silence like a deadly blow. The door slammed shut in front of me. I jumped back, seized by panic, and in an instant, I was running through the corridors, not looking back. My body acted instinctively. I ran like a madman, gripped by fear for Marta. The corridors echoed with every step, every sound, as if shadows were chasing me. Every turn felt like a trap, every step a chance for something invisible to catch me. My thoughts were tangled, and my heart beat so hard I could barely breathe. I was consumed by the fear that Marta would disappear too, like everyone else. I couldn't allow myself to lose her. She was the only thing keeping me grounded in reality, in this nightmare that had become my life. When I finally reached the communication room, the door flew open as if the ship itself felt the tension within me. Relief washed over me when I saw Marta. She was alive and unharmed, but her gaze said it all. In her anxious eyes was the same fear that gripped me. Her face was pale, her fingers trembled slightly, and it seemed that any sound could shatter the fragile silence that hung between us. But we couldn't let panic destroy us both, so I decided to hide the truth about what had happened in Natalie and Max's cabin. My wife silently squeezed my hand, her touch cold and unusually firm, as if she was clinging to the last hope. This feeling united us in shared fear, but at the same time, it sparked a determination not to succumb to what was happening around us. When we decided to move on, the ship's corridors greeted us with their oppressive emptiness. Each step echoed in the silence, as if we were the only living beings on this ship. What was once a space filled with life and sound now seemed like a labyrinth where the walls and floor silently watched us. The feeling that someone was watching us never left for a moment. Dark corners, dimly lit mirrors scattered throughout the corridors, constantly made us look back. A quick glance at the reflection revealed vague silhouettes, but they instantly dissolved when you tried to focus on them. A treacherous whisper crept into our heads, soft and insistent, like a distant wind bringing words you don't want to hear. Their names constantly echoed in the air, as if someone, invisible and sinister, was calling them in a whisper. The whisper came from every crack in the walls, filled every corner of the ship, enveloping us like a web that tightened more and more. It wasn't just a feeling of danger, but something more. A sense of inevitability creeping out of the darkness and getting closer. With each step, the atmosphere around us became more unbearable. The oppressive silence seemed heavier than air, swallowing all sounds and thoughts. I couldn't shake the conviction that there was something dark, invisible on this ship, something that was waiting for us. In these corridors, we were not alone, but not because there were other people. What was watching us was something entirely different, incomprehensible, and relentless. Suddenly, Marta stopped. She froze, listening, and I also began to listen to the silence when a child's laughter echoed down the corridor. It was a short, light laugh, as if a child had run by. A few more short steps, and everything went quiet. I felt Marta trembling beside me. Her body seemed to be gripped by a piercing cold. She almost fell, but I managed to catch her. Marta cried, clinging to me, her body convulsing with fear, and tears streamed down her pale cheeks. She had always been overly sensitive to anything related to the unknown, so seeing her so frightened was unbearable. Anxiety and helplessness awoke in me, feelings I had tried to suppress. I had to act. I had to save her. We continued to search for any living soul on this cursed ship. The corridors, which had recently been filled with life and movement, now seemed empty and hostile. People seemed to have dissolved into the air. Empty cabins and halls testified that we were alone. We decided to descend to the lower decks, hoping to find the medical bay. My head was splitting with pain, as if hundreds of needles were piercing my consciousness. The corridors of the lower levels were even darker and colder. The shadows seemed deeper, their shapes hiding in the corners, as if waiting for our weakness. Every sound made me uneasy, heightening the sense of an invisible threat. Suddenly, I heard a metallic clatter in the adjacent room. Startled, I instinctively moved towards the source of the sound. My heart clenched as I realized where I had ended up. Before me was the ship's morgue. The air was filled with the smell of disinfectant, and the white tiled walls resembled a sterile trap. Rows of body storage chambers stood motionless, like silent witnesses to death. I froze, trying to make sense of the silence, but heard nothing more. Only silence. Closing one of the chambers, I tried to gather my thoughts, when suddenly a figure emerged from the darkness before me. I stood silently, trying to understand what I was seeing. It was a tall man, but his face was unrecognizable. It looked dead, gray, cracked skin, as if he had spent an eternity underwater. His eyes were dark holes, gaping voids that seemed empty, and the cracks on his skin spread from his mouth to his ears, turning his face into a bloody mask of fear. His hair was gray and tangled, bits of seaweed hanging from his shoulders as if he had just risen from the ocean floor. His body looked horrific. The skin and muscles sagged, exposing bones that resembled seashells washed ashore. His arms were thin and fragile, as if a touch would turn them to dust. I saw him reaching out to me with those skeletal, almost transparent fingers. Their touch could leave only terrible, bloody scratches on me. Cold seeped into my core. I felt my heart begin to pound wildly, beating in my chest so hard that blood pulsed in my head. I couldn't move. My body no longer obeyed me. My legs gave way, and I fell to the cold floor. My breathing became shallow, my hands and feet trembled, gripped by a fear I had never known before. Before me stood something that shouldn't exist. It was a horrific embodiment of what the depths of darkness conceal. One thought flashed through my mind. Could this be a ghost? One of the passengers or crew members who died here on this cursed ship? Perhaps this is all the result of some dark ritual or dangerous experiment that we shouldn't even know about. Cold and terror pierced me to the bone, and everything that once seemed real now looked blurred and alien. Every sound from outside only intensified this feeling, making the atmosphere even more eerie. I tried to gather my strength to get up, but before me was only emptiness and fear. The figure disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving me standing in this gloomy place. Barely pulling myself together, I stumbled back to Marta. My mind was shattered and vulnerable, but the only thing that kept me moving forward was the determination to do everything possible to protect her. Although I tried to remain calm on the outside, inside me was chaos. I feared that the horror I had seen was just the beginning of something much worse. When Marta called out to me, her voice was filled with anxiety. I could hear her fear even through the closed door. Her panic transmitted to me, causing a new surge of terror. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest. I couldn't let her know what I had seen. Feeling cold sweat cover my forehead, I tried to speak calmly. My voice betrayed me, sounding hollow and uneven, but I did everything to ensure she didn't sense my fear. I asked her to stay in the corridor, promising that I would come out myself. With each step towards the door, I felt the trembling take over my entire body. I couldn't afford to break down. Not now. When I finally left the morgue, I tried to ignore the shaking in my legs, as if I was walking on thin ice that was about to give way. I saw Marta standing pressed against the wall, her body trembling with fear. She was pale as a ghost. I approached and hugged her, feeling her heart beating rapidly, which only intensified my own fears. Gently taking the first aid kit from her hands, I tried to remain firm and resolute, though inside me raged a fear I had never known before. We moved further down the corridor, hoping to find some explanation for everything that was happening, but instead, the feeling of an invisible presence only grew stronger. The silence around us pressed on our ears, as if the air had become thicker, heavier. I listened to every step Marta took beside me. Her breathing was heavy, almost inaudible. At some point, it seemed to me that the corridor had become too quiet, too empty. I stopped, and this feeling only intensified. I looked at Marta. She was gone. I looked around in both directions, but she had simply vanished. The corridor remained empty, with no trace of her. Panic slowly began to creep up on me. I called out to her, but instead I heard light breathing, not hers. Quiet, barely noticeable, like the rustle of air. It was approaching. Soft, barely audible footsteps echoed somewhere behind me. But when I turned sharply, there was only emptiness behind me. My heart pounded in my throat, and cold sweat ran down my back. After a few seconds of silence, I heard a familiar sound. Laughter. A child's laughter, the same one we had heard earlier. It sounded nearby, but there was no one there. Desperately gulping for air, I moved forward, trying to convince myself that it was just hallucinations, just fear. But the footsteps, laughter, and quiet song that began to play from nowhere convinced me otherwise. Ahead, on the floor of the corridor, something lay. I approached and saw a doll, an old, battered doll with a faded face and a torn dress. Its eyes were open and staring straight at me. When I leaned in to take a closer look, it creaked softly, as if someone had turned its head. I jumped back, my heart pounding in my chest, and for a moment it seemed that someone was watching me from the shadows of the corridor. The feeling of cold was so unbearable that it seemed as if the air had become thick and heavy. Each breath cut my lungs, like frost penetrating deep inside. I couldn't take my eyes off this doll. Its eyes seemed to come to life, cold and indifferent, like those of a real creature. The surroundings took on a ghostly quality. The walls, which had previously seemed ordinary, now seemed to breathe and pulse in time with my heartbeat. I stood in this space, filled with shadows and fear, as if the world was closing in around me. The heavy silence began to be interrupted by faint noises. Footsteps? Whispers? I couldn't quite tell. From the ceiling, a sticky darkness seemed to drip, and the floor beneath my feet vibrated with an inexplicable force that I could feel under my skin. The doll silently stared at me, and each of its motionless gestures seemed filled with hidden menace. Time seemed to slow down, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Suddenly, something changed behind me. I sensed the air becoming different, heavier, more tense. An elusive sound, like a muffled sob, penetrated the silence. My heart fluttered in my chest again, and I felt that I was not alone here. The doll lay on the corridor floor, its cold, empty eyes staring straight at me, and it seemed that the air around it had become heavier, filled with something invisible and sinister. I stood, unable to take my eyes off its distorted face, and couldn't understand why it evoked such deep, irrational fear in me. The corridor around was immersed in ghostly darkness, with only faint light from the lamps flickering somewhere far ahead, casting long, frightening shadows. Suddenly, the silence was pierced by a sound resembling a gasping sob. Before I could comprehend what was happening, Marta rushed at me, her face gaunt, wet with tears, trembling all over, clutching me in desperation. Her hands were cold, her fingers painfully gripping my shoulders. Her body's trembling was uncontrollable, and her breathing was heavy and erratic. The chaos in her eyes, the fear that had completely taken over her, hit me like a blast of cold wind. The words she uttered seemed jumbled, her voice trembling with panic. Marta pleaded, asking why I had left her in the medical bay. Her words struck me like blows. She had waited, and I hadn't come. She recounted how she had been left alone in that dark, deserted space as time passed, and I was nowhere to be found. This moment seemed to fracture the reality around us. Everything suddenly took on a new, horrifying meaning. I felt the pressure in my chest increase, my heart pounding louder as realization began to seep into my consciousness. Memories surfaced before me like shadows from the darkness. When I left the medical bay, I heard footsteps behind me, thought it was Marta, and we walked together in the silent corridor. But now it seemed absurd. Marta hadn't been with me. All this time, I had been walking with someone else. I turned my head back to look at the doll lying on the floor, but it was gone. The empty spot where the toy had just been radiated a dreadful silence that seemed to engulf the surrounding space. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt that I had just encountered not Marta, but something else that had been waiting for me in that darkness. Once everything fell into place, panic overwhelmed me like a tide. What I had seen in the corridor was not Marta. Something had been waiting for me, stalking me, and now I was certain. We had to flee immediately. I gripped her hand tightly, not taking my eyes off the dim light that flickered as if sensing our anxiety. The air was heavy, damp, and it seemed that with each step, breathing became more difficult. Marta trembled, her breathing uneven, like convulsive gasps of fear, and I couldn't let her see how terrified I was. The only thought that persistently hammered in my head was, find the deck, escape from here. The ship seemed unreal. The corridors narrowed. The walls seemed to lean towards us, as if leading us into a trap. I felt the floor slipping under my feet, the wooden planks barely creaking under the pressure. Our steps were barely audible, more like vibrations under our weight. I looked at the doors along the corridor, and each one seemed abandoned, as if everyone who had been on this ship had long left or simply vanished. It was hard to tell if these were traces of our despair or if reality itself was distorting, playing tricks on us. We ran through several more corridors, and I felt panic pressing down, like a cold fog filling my consciousness, preventing rational thought. My thoughts swirled. Would there be a lifeboat here? Could we descend and find something that would lead to salvation? Or was this just another trap? Perhaps our chances of escape were diminishing with each passing second, and this ship would not let us leave alive. Each corridor seemed longer than the previous one, and each step felt as if we were getting closer to something invisible, hiding behind our backs. The feeling that we were being pursued was indescribably strong. It seemed that the ship itself was alive, pulling us into its depths. Marta stumbled, breathing heavily beside me, and her weakness only added to the sense of doom. I couldn't afford to stop, but each of her gasps, each heavy breath pulled me back to reality. Time was running out, and the fear was becoming more palpable. We had to find a way out, hide, escape. We reached the deck, our feet slipping on the wet planks, and ahead of us was the lifeboat, our only chance to escape this dreadful ship. It was quiet, too quiet. Only our heavy breaths broke the silence. I grabbed the ropes, trying to untie them, and one thought flashed through my mind. We need to get away, the sooner the better. But these hands, which once performed tasks so steadily, now trembled. The thought of what could go wrong haunted me. Would the ropes hold? Would we be worse off in this open ocean, filled with unknown horrors? As the lifeboat began to slowly descend, the ropes emitted an eerie creak, as if the ship was protesting our escape. It shook and threatened to snap at any moment, creating the feeling that the ship wouldn't let us go so easily. I watched as it slowly approached the water, my heart pounding, and one thought echoed in my mind. Could we make it? Marta got into the lifeboat first. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but she held on as best she could. My hands were sweating, and the ropes seemed alive. Each new creak threatened our only hope of salvation. The lifeboat, swaying, finally touched the water, leaving me alone with the ship. I had to find a way to get down to it, but the feeling that something unseen was watching me filled my entire being. And then it happened. Cold air suddenly hit my back, and a sense of danger engulfed me. It was as if something invisible was standing next to me. I felt its heavy presence, the cold seeping through my clothes to my very bones. I was about to turn to see what it was, when suddenly something struck me in the back with tremendous force. The whole world turned upside down, and I fell down. The impact with the water was like hitting a rock, sharp and unexpected. Water surrounded me from all sides, and at that moment, reality dissolved into chaos. The murky depths of the ocean swallowed me, the cold and boundless space pulling me into its depths. I couldn't breathe, couldn't find any support. My lungs were bursting from the lack of air, my hands flailed around in vain, hoping to grab onto something. But there was only emptiness around. My eyes tried in vain to focus in the murky water, as if the world had suddenly lost its familiar contours. And then something flickered nearby. An oar. It floated right in front of my eyes, like a ghostly lifeline I had to grab. With one last effort, no longer feeling my arms or legs, I reached out and grabbed it. It was the only connection to life. I pulled myself up, dragging myself out of the cold embrace of the water. Air hit my lungs again, and I, choking, broke through to the surface, gasping for air as if it was my only chance for salvation. I surfaced, trying to greedily inhale air, but instead, my lungs filled with salty seawater. It rushed into my throat, burning from the inside, and I choked again, desperately trying to take even one full breath. The world around was utter chaos. Water, night, clouds that covered the stars, and the distant sound of thunder, adding to the hopelessness of this place. Finally gathering my strength, I took a deep breath. It cut through everything inside like a sharp knife, and my lungs exploded with pain from the sudden influx of oxygen. A hoarse cough erupted from me. Each breath was agony, but now I could finally breathe. The water around was cold, and I felt it draining the last warmth from my body. Gradually, as the worst fear subsided, Marta managed to pull me to the lifeboat. Her hands shook no less than mine, but she held on, whispering something under her breath. With the last of my strength, holding onto the oar, I finally pulled myself to the side. Together we managed to get me inside the lifeboat, my body refusing to move, and every muscle ached from the strain. I lay at the bottom, gasping for air, trying to calm down, but it seemed impossible. My hands and feet trembled, as if I had lost the last crumbs of control. The sea abyss surrounded us on all sides, and this desperate retreat from the ship brought no relief. On the contrary, the sense of hopelessness became even sharper. Here, in the darkness and vastness of the ocean, I truly felt how powerless we were. Marta sat next to me, her body trembling, but she didn't utter a word. I looked at her and saw the reflection of my own fear, the loneliness that had engulfed us both. The silence was oppressive. Only the waves gently rocked the lifeboat, as if reminding us that we were still here, in the middle of the ocean's emptiness. And then that nightmare resurfaced in my memory, the dream that had haunted me for the past few days. We were in the ocean, in the darkness, and Marta was slowly sinking, and I couldn't save her. Back then, it seemed like just an ordinary fear, but now I realized how real nightmares could be. I looked at Marta, and the thought that this was just the beginning seemed unbearable. We sat in the lifeboat under the scorching sun, and time dragged on as if it had frozen. No sound except for the rustling of the waves and the wind tearing from the endless expanse of the sea. Each minute felt like an eternity. The hot sun, from which there was no escape, burned our skin, melting even the smallest remnants of strength we still had. The seawater evaporated on our skin, leaving only salty traces that itched and burned. Only now did I realize how thoughtlessly we had fled that dreadful ship. In our panic and fear of the unknown, we hadn't even taken food, water, or any plan of action with us. It seemed that fear had driven us then. Now we drifted in the vast, watery desert with no idea of what to do next. The longer we floated, the more the sense of doom grew. Each new wave that washed over our boat was like a whisper of our helplessness before the merciless ocean. Marta sat, staring into the distance, silent and exhausted. Her gaze was empty, but I knew our thoughts were aligned. The waves became increasingly relentless, and under the scorching sky, our bodies weakened, deprived of energy and hope. Suddenly I noticed a silhouette on the horizon, a yacht. My soul froze for a moment, then awakened with new hope. At first it seemed like just a mirage or our fear-clouded minds, but the silhouette remained, moving closer. I tried to stand up, awkwardly waving my arms, and the lifeboat dangerously tilted under my weight. Marta, too, noticing this small ray of hope sprang up, and we both, forgetting about caution, began waving our arms, calling for help. Our bodies, weakened from the prolonged struggle with the sun and fear, barely maintained balance, and for a moment it seemed we might capsize, but it no longer mattered. All our efforts were focused on attracting the attention of the people on board. The yacht approached, and we saw several figures on its deck. They moved, and I felt hope return. We clambered onto the yacht, exhausted and worn out. Several strangers greeted us, immediately surrounding and helping us onto the deck. At first, they seemed friendly, dressed in ordinary clothes, but the feeling that something was wrong didn't leave me. However, the joy of rescue pushed any troubling thoughts to the background. Marta sank onto the couch that stood in the shade. Beside her sat a woman in a peculiar dress, reminiscent of the 1920s. The light fabric shimmered in the sun, but something about it seemed out of place. Perhaps due to my fatigue, I didn't pay much attention to it. Everyone was talking, but the words dissolved into the noise, as if I heard them through a thick layer of water. They focused on Marta, whispering something soothing and gentle to her, completely ignoring me, as if I were just an outsider in my own nightmare. With each passing minute, the tension within me grew. Something was wrong. The silence between their words, the faint smell of decay slowly seeping into my nostrils, made my heart beat faster. I moved closer, trying to understand why these people were acting so strangely and ignoring me while fawning over Marta. I couldn't stand it and grabbed one of them by the arm, trying to make him stop, maybe get at least a glance or some reaction. But what I felt pierced me with fear to the bone. His hand was cold as ice and damp, as if just pulled out of water. My heart froze. When I looked up, I saw not an ordinary man. His skin was bluish, cold. Water was dripping from his face and clothes, running down his sleeves and dripping onto the deck. My breathing became erratic. I glanced around at the people. They all looked the same. Water dripped from their bodies, forming puddles at their feet. Their faces were colorless, their eyes empty. The cold emanating from them was unbearable, as if they had just risen from the ocean depths. Death filled the air, permeating everything around, though there was no apparent threat. I felt my whole body go numb with horror as I turned my gaze to Marta. She sat, as if enchanted, next to the woman in the dress. But now the dress looked completely different. It had lost its shine, seemed rotten from moisture. Water dripped from the woman's hair, tangled with seaweed and shells. Her skin had turned bluish like the others, her face lifeless, resembling a corpse just pulled from the water. Marta looked at her, entranced. Her face remained calm, as if she had finally found rest. This scared me even more. She did not react to the world around her. Her eyes were empty, her gaze lifeless. She had completely surrendered to these phantoms, completely detached from reality. I rushed to her, desperately trying to pull her out of this nightmare, but the same figures blocked my way. They seemed not to move, but their weight, cold and unnatural, prevented me from passing. I touched them, and the cold from that touch made my body shiver. They were draining the life out of me, no matter how hard I tried to break free. Marta, like a puppet on strings, slowly rose. The woman in the dress extended her hand to her, and I saw water dripping from her fingers. My eyes watched in horror as Marta's fingers touched that bluish hand. Their touch merged into one movement, so natural, yet horribly inhuman. Their fingers intertwined, and Marta obediently followed her to the edge of the deck. Her steps were slow but irreversible, as if she were walking into an abyss that only I could see. The fog that lay over the water grew thicker, darker, enveloping the deck in a ghostly shroud. The light was fading, and the only sound left was the soft rustling of the waves against the ship's hull. This quiet, repetitive sound blended with the splashing of water, and a panic was born in my heart. The air became thicker, heavier, as if the ocean itself was trying to pull me into its depths. I saw Marta approaching the edge of the deck, but I could do nothing to stop her. Something invisible held me back. The cold figures wouldn't let me move. Each moment stretched into eternity as I watched her walk towards the water, losing consciousness, while helplessness pierced me through. This feeling of hopelessness made it hard to breathe. She was already standing at the very edge of the deck, surrounded by ghostly figures merging with the gray fog, creating a veil between her and the world of the living. Marta suddenly shuddered, as if waking from a terrible dream. Her eyes widened in horror. She silently stared into the faces of those standing beside her, and then her screams tore through the silence like knives, making my heart freeze. It was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It seemed that even the deepest darkness of the ocean could shatter from it. Marta tried to break free from their hands. Her movements were desperate, but the stranger with the bluish face held her tightly, like shackles. Her blue lips twisted into a barely noticeable smile, as lifeless as her body. Her voice, like a vibration from the depths of the ocean, quietly said, "You will be a perfect addition to our group." These words froze the blood in my veins. I saw dozens of hands, cold and dead, close around Marta. She screamed, her eyes filled with panic, her body trembling with fear. I couldn't move, lost in this nightmare. The phantoms dragged her to the edge, and in one horrifying moment, when her scream reached its highest note, they pushed her into the dark abyss of water. The last thing I saw were her eyes. Wide with fear, they pleaded with me for help. But I was powerless. My body was paralyzed. My legs wouldn't obey, and I just stood there, watching her fall into the water. Her body disappeared into the black waves, and at that moment I felt my heart break from pain and despair. And only when the phantoms disappeared, I was suddenly released. Without thinking, like a beast, I rushed to the edge of the deck and jumped after her into the water. The cold of the ocean enveloped me in icy embraces. I swam with all my might, pushing through the heavy thickness of the water, trying to reach Marta. I saw her. She was slowly sinking, reaching out to me, as if trying to grasp the last hope. But with each wave, she sank deeper and deeper into the ocean depths, dragging my soul with her. I surfaced, gasping for air, but instead of a breath, a scream of despair tore from my chest. The whole world shattered. I was left alone in the middle of the ocean. There was nothing around. The yacht had vanished, dissolved into the fog as if it had never existed. Only a lifeboat drifted nearby, a silent witness to the entire tragedy. The emptiness around made my heart tremble with horror. Marta's death, the disappearance of the yacht, the phantoms, it all seemed like part of some inhuman conspiracy. And I was left alone, engulfed by endless pain and fear. I barely crawled into the lifeboat. Each movement was unbearably heavy. My body felt heavy, as if it belonged not to me, but to a piece of dead stone. I lay at the bottom, feeling my last strength gradually leaving me. The cold water seeped through my clothes, but I barely noticed it. Pain and horror filled my consciousness, making me forget everything else. I just lay there, trying to breathe. The air seemed thick and heavy, as if each breath took the last drops of energy. My throat tightened, my chest burned. Each breath was like a knife in my lungs. My only eye remained fixed on the blue sky. It was so clear, so calm. Irony. After all this nightmare, after seeing Marta disappear into the abyss, the world around remained mercilessly calm. It was the last thing I saw before my eyes closed and darkness finally engulfed me. When I came to, I was surrounded by the white walls of the infirmary. The light wasn't harsh, but it seemed unnaturally clean. Something about this place repelled me. I didn't understand where I was, who I was. My body felt heavy, like in the lifeboat, but this time the muscles felt like something separate from me. They found me drifting in the ocean. Another cruise liner spotted me while returning to port. This feeling, it hit me like a hammer. I was found again. Another liner. More water. More horror. My consciousness began to tear apart. My heart pounded so hard I felt it hammering against my ribs, as if trying to break free. My hands trembled, my palms covered in cold sweat. I shuddered at every thought, every memory. It seemed like the phantoms were back, that I would never escape this nightmare. The shadows of the phantoms. Marta. Their hands. It all came alive in me again and again. Despair consumed me, and I couldn't stop it. I lunged forward, grabbing the nurse standing nearby, my hands closing around her neck. I couldn't stop. All these images, the phantoms, their cold hands. I felt them again. She tried to break free, but I kept squeezing, feeling her body twitch under my fingers. Was this real or another phantom? I didn't understand. Didn't want to understand. Then, suddenly, something pricked me. A needle pierced my skin, and the world began to blur. The horror receded, washed away by a wave of thick darkness that slowly filled me. I was falling deeper and deeper into a place where there was nothing but emptiness. When I opened my eyes again, there was no certainty that everything around was real. I no longer trusted any of my senses. Every second was a doubt. Every corner of the room seemed like another phantom fragment of the horror I was trying to escape. The liner, the people around me, the sound of the ocean beyond the walls. It could all be another illusion. I didn't trust any sound, any sight. I didn't sleep, barely ate. My eyes remained open, ready for the phantoms to appear again, to drag me down once more. When I finally stepped onto solid ground, there was an atmosphere of indifference around. Dry faces of people, impeccable suits of the cruise company representatives, empty, lifeless words of sympathy. They felt as empty as I did. But the worst was yet to come. The worst awaited me when I found out what had happened. We were recorded as an accident. Just another statistic. Thousands of people on cruises face various dangers every year, and we were just one of them. No one wanted to delve into the details. No one cared how I survived, why the others disappeared without a trace. It was all masked as a minor incident, blamed on bad weather conditions and loss of contact with the liner. But I knew it was something else. My account of what happened was taken as the result of hallucinations. Some doctors hinted that maybe I had drunk too much alcohol. Others suggested that the shock I experienced simply caused visions. Some smiled through their teeth, considering it a lie I made up to get attention. But I saw that horror. I felt it. Marta's face, her last look, the icy hand of that woman in the old dress. It haunted me constantly, even in waking moments. Then, the worst happened. When the tour company representatives offered me monetary compensation for the inconvenience, something clicked inside me. I saw their eyes. They hid fear, concealed knowledge. They knew about it. I couldn't understand how or why, but they knew. They didn't just want to close the case with money. They were trying to buy my silence. Silence about the fact that this route was not simple, that this tour was offered cheaply because something else was happening on the liner, something few knew about, and those who knew tried to hide it. My life changed forever after that. The nightmare of that night didn't leave me even on land. It seemed like I had left the sea behind, but it continued to haunt me in the smallest details. Every whisper of the wind reminded me of those voices on the deck. Every puddle of rain made me shudder. I avoided any bodies of water, rivers, lakes, even ordinary fountains in the park. Every time I saw my reflection in the water, another one appeared next to it, Marta's. Her face always looked the same as in the last moment before she disappeared into the depths. It was my curse, my eternal trauma. I could no longer be near water without feeling the cold shiver of its presence. These visions became part of me. They settled in the deepest corners of my mind. Even on the calmest days, when it seemed like life was returning to normal, I felt that same icy touch that once took everything from me. This was something I had to live with for the rest of my life. Now, let me share a moment from my life. I am an artist, and oil painting is both exciting and relaxing for me. About 8 years ago, I became so passionate about oil painting that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day, I looked back and realized what knowledge I needed when I first started. So I prepared an intensive course of 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or unnecessary chatter, just rich content that is immediately applicable in practice, all for the price of 1 day of car rental. Art therapy is a great way to cope with your anxieties. Link in profile or description.